Morning, everybody. Happy hump days. Welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined, I haven't seen him for a while, actually, by my fellow Mirror columnist, Darren Lewis. Darren, you've been avoiding us, clearly.
Not at all, not at all. This is one of my favourite points of the week. And it has been quite a busy old time as well. So it's really good. I say busy old time, and I'm all smiles, but obviously this isn't a good time for anybody right now. The world is holding its breath, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a bit of a grim time. We're going to try and get through some of that today. Now, this is the People's Pay-Per-View, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to deal with them for you. Please don't be either Israel or Iran in the comments, okay? Because we're not going to deal with sort of government lines on either of those points. What matters most is the people who are in the centre of that conflict on both sides, not the government lines. Now, those of you listening later on podcast will just have to wonder if the news from the Middle East is ever going to be actually something new. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on Iran's decision yesterday to launch 182 missiles at civilian areas in Israel in response to Israel's decision to launch a limited ground attack on Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which of course has been a proxy for the Iranian state that wants to wipe out Israel for many years. Now, Darren, this is just sort of the latest tit for tat in a conflict that frankly has been raging on without cease for the entirety of our lifetimes and before. But this is escalating now, isn't it? Iran's stopped using proxies to fight Israel. It's doing so itself. And it came too late for last night's papers, but it was confirmed overnight that the US and our own Royal Air Force were involved in shooting down some of those missiles in order to protect Israeli civilians. So there's talk of all-out war. What do you think?
Well, you've summed it up very well, and the Daily Mirror splash characterises the situation well, because revenge is the word, and as you say, this didn't begin with the horrors, and we have to recognise those horrors of October 7. We're approaching the anniversary at the moment, but it didn't begin with that. It began way before that. But it's escalated to a point where Iran has issued that statement yesterday, and all of us were glued to the TV, weren't we? As they said that it was revenge for the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, the Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh, and basically it said that if there was to be a response from Israel, then it would be met with, in the words of the statement, a crushing further action. Now, as Chris was saying, this is a really tense moment for the world, because, and I'll be honest with you, Susie, I kind of have been hoping to hear politicians talking about de-escalation and about stopping the killing, the cycle of blood, as it were, because there has been murder on all sides. And I had been hoping to see politicians really ratchet down the rhetoric, but instead they've been talking about rights to defend and this, that, and the other. And we've got this, and if this were to happen, that were to happen. And people are quite rightly very, very concerned about the moment we found ourselves with. I wonder, Susie, if normally there is a grown-up in the room. Normally there's someone, the US has the most influence over Israel. Because there is, however, that power vacuum, Biden obviously has been replaced by Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is not yet, there's 4 weeks to go until the election. There isn't really somebody to basically, say, we've got to stop this here.
It's got to be said as well that Joe Biden, as you saw when he pulled out of Afghanistan, he's not the kind of US president that wants to go in and deal with foreign states' problems. He has said, as America has all the way along, that they'll protect Israel and all the rest of it. He sent his carrier there to help intercept some of the missiles. But he's not been the kind of president for example, that Donald Trump was, that was just absolutely gung-ho for one side or the other, and hasn't really been engaged. So you've got that vacuum anyway. Then you have another vacuum, which is the US presidential election, which means whoever is making a decision right now is not going to be the person who's making a decision come January. And then you have the fact, of course, that the current Israeli government, which is a loose coalition involving some ultra-nationalists who do not have public support, really, in Israel itself.
And that's really important.
Well, not listening to them anyway.
No, you're right. I think it's really important for you to make that distinction, because the current Israeli government doesn't have widespread support across the country. And lots of people, and the more this continues, the further away a diplomatic solution appears to be. Just like we've been sympathetic to the people who have had their lives torn apart in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Beirut, your hearts go out to the Israeli people. They're cowering in bomb shelters while the whole thing is playing out. Yes, it was spectacular to look at yesterday as the bombs rained down, but also terrifying as well, because at the center of this is the people. And it cannot, lots of us have friends who are over there, or who have family over there, who don't want to see this happen. So the vacuum that you talk about is so important and so terrifying, because who does step into the breach and try to broker a diplomatic solution?
Well, there's been talk of that happening, of course, and it being very close to the point of an agreement, but then one side or the other sort of sabotaging it and getting blamed for the other person did it and all the rest of it. What do you think, everybody? Do you worry that we're on the edge of all-out war? Do you think that we're sliding to some kind of abyss that there's no way out of, or do you feel a bit more optimistic about it? Leslie says, we shouldn't be taking sides in the Middle East. Two wrongs have never made a right. How is this going to end? That's exactly the question, Leslie. No one knows how it's going to end, and no one can kind of see an off-ramp for anybody, really, to get out of where we are. So one of the things that being muttered about is that Israel, which since October the 7th has been very ruthless in taking out what it sees as threats to its security, quite reasonably so in some cases, but first in Gaza, which just got flattened, and the West Bank, which has been very badly oppressed. And then Hezbollah in Lebanon with the attacks on exploding walkie-talkies and pagers and so on, which took out, again, a lot of civilians as well as the people that were targeted. It's now considering, apparently, a limited series of airstrikes is being discussed on Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, Darren, that's the one thing which has changed in the course of this conflict, right? So when I was growing up, we had exactly the same footage on our TV screens of, bodies and dust and cement and blitzes and things like this. But what's changed in the course of this is that we're now talking about nuclear armed nations. Israel is believed to have nukes, although it's never confirmed that. And that's Iran's argument as to why they have had in the past some uranium enrichment facilities, the UN and weapons inspectors and so on. I've tried to keep on top of that. We don't think they've got as far as warheads, but they definitely have like some nasty stuff we don't want them to start playing with. That's the real risk, isn't it? It's the risk as far as Israel's concerned. They don't want Iran to start nuking it. And when you have religious fundamentalists who all think that this is their chosen route to heaven and that's where things are going to be better, they don't have the same amount to lose, perhaps, as those of us who are in more secular nations, have more secular outlooks, who go, do you know, I'd just rather we didn't nuke everything. That's the risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think in simple terms, everyone seems to be saber rattling and showing their capability, almost in an attempt to escalate rather than to de-escalate. Because, as you say, you remember years ago, decades ago, when there had been this kind of conflict, and in the intervening years, countries have built up their capability, nuclear or otherwise. Or I should say, and otherwise. So now you've got a situation where Israel is wanting to take out whatever capability Iran does have. Iran, the experts say, have yet to show their hand as far as their capability. is concerned, even though we did see those 200 ballistic warheads hit, according to our colleagues at Sky News and geolocation information areas in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and elsewhere. This is not going to end well if there isn't a diplomatic solution. And I think what the Middle East going up in flames does represent for a lot of people is almost a prelude to a wider war, because if obviously the allies of Israel get involved, then you would assume the allies of Iran get involved, and then where does that end? So
well, it ends with America and China then, doesn't it, and Russia?
Well, indeed. And it worries people. You know, I know, and you know this even more so given the work that you've done. There is this convention, isn't there, that the Prime Minister, or there are no big interviews during the Tory party or each other's conference. So we were unlikely to see Sir Keir Starmer doing a big interview during this period. But actually, that's kind of been seen to be quite anachronistic, because right now, leadership is needed more than ever. Now, there might be some people who say, well, hang on a minute, the UK in this, they're peripheral. Because at the end of the day, the only one with influence over the Israelis is America. But at the same time, people in this country are concerned. People don't want to be drawn into another war. People want to know, okay, if it is the case that we were aiding this effort yesterday, how are we aiding it? What were we doing? Give us some detail. Give us some context. People don't want to be drawn into another war. So there are lots of very anxious people around the country right now, and indeed around the world.
And of course, and if the RAF are being used, it's obviously that we're not peripheral. We're a chief ally of America. We have bases in Cyprus, where the Defence Secretary John Healey is today, and you know, we have the hardware in the area, and we also have, of course, let's not forget, an historic responsibility for what happens to Palestine pre-war. Anyone's seen Lawrence of Arabia? That is a fact-based drama, everybody. And we have some responsibilities for what's befallen that area since then. Richard says, I remember it not being all that long ago. Iran had inspectors going in to assure the United Nations, etc. They had no weapons program in full swing. Yep, and that has happened. But what we need to bear in mind is that when you have conflict like this, okay, Israel has got all the infrastructure, the kit, the equipment, and the ability to use it. It has the highly trained military, which can go and have a big offensive. Iran has got the Republican Guard and so on. It's got military, but it's just not the same. And it probably couldn't fight a one-on-one war with Israel. But what it is very good at is having these proxies, having terror cells all around the world, all around the Middle East, which could go in and do something devastating with only 3 or 4 people. And that's asymmetrical.
Given I can't remember the person who you just mentioned a second ago, but Richard. I remember there were a number of years, Richard, talking about Iran's secrecy, UN inspectors and whatnot. I remember there had been a very, very long period within which Israel were. There was a lot of debate, shall we say, an argument and over whether Iran were allowing inspectors to come in and see what their capability had been, what they had been doing. And there is this widespread perception, as you were saying quite rightly, that they don't have the ability to withstand an attack from Israel or to respond. But what do we know about their capability? Well, because they have been so secret for so long, because they have kept their cards so very close to their chest, what do we actually know about what they have within their armory?
Yeah, well, you know, there's been talk as well recently of Putin and Ukraine also being connected with Iranian missiles and who's making missiles for whom, that's going in what direction. It's just Leslie says none of them have the capability and strength to stop this. History has taught us nothing. It's a depressing point, Leslie. It probably leads us on to our next story quite well, unfortunately. It's obviously now, I suppose, Keir Starmer, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, other world leaders to decide somehow how far Israel's right to defend itself can extend and how much further we have to descend into the abyss before all these neighbours decide that they'd rather live together in peace and harmony rather than slaughter and bloodshed. We're not there yet, clearly. Hopefully we'll be before long. Now, on to the main story of the day. And it's probably actually not the main story of the day. There's not lots of people covering this, but it's one that should have had more attention yesterday, certainly than it's got, I think, in today's papers, probably because of what's happened overnight in Lebanon. It will certainly have reverberations into the future. So Henry Staunton, the man who was tasked with running the post office very recently and sacked very recently, if you remember, by Kemi Badenoch when she was, before she was a Tory leadership hopeful and was still a Tory minister, not 5 minutes ago, he gave evidence to the Post Office inquiry yesterday. Now, here's the chap that she said she had to sack because he was involved in bullying and racism and lots of other things. But he gave evidence about what he found at the Post Office when he took over. Long after the wrongful prosecutions of thousands of sub-postmasters for stealing money that it turned out the computer system had actually lost, not them. And what he had to say was quite astonishing, wasn't it, Darren? Can you take us through this a little bit?
Well, yes. I mean, as we've said in our leader today, the more you learn about this scandal, the worse it seems to get, because the evidence of Kemi Badenoch basically suggesting, the post office's bosses and their appetite to exonerate the postmasters who were wrongly prosecuted, well, it just wasn't there. It just was not there. And Henry Staunton, as you were saying, he argued that the post office was dragging its feet. He accused the last government of wanting to delay payments to sub-postmasters because they were concerned that the money could reach £1 billion. And the allegation is that there is no appetite in clearing names. In fact, there was a letter apparently from Nick Reed suggesting that there was a will to stand by the prosecutions of the sub-postmasters. And all the way through this, the thing that struck me was that it's almost like a checklist for every other scandal we've seen. Institutional scandal, COVID, Hillsborough, Windrush, the blood scandal, the vet scandal that you've worked so hard on. There have been so many areas. Stephen Lawrence. It's like a checklist for every single institutional scandal we have seen over the last 5 decades.
Exactly. Is that what Leslie was just saying? We don't learn from history. We've seen it played out over and over and over again, and we just don't figure it out. So one of the things Henry was saying was that the post office still thought it had done no wrong at all. And this is after, all right, the High Court had ruled that thousands of convictions were unsafe. This is after people were released from having been in jail where they should never have been. And there were still people at the top of that organisation, which was an arm of the British state, remember, who said, well, we didn't do anything wrong. And who said, well, we don't want to pay out that much money. Like that was what mattered. Like it was still their reputation. Like it was still the fact the British state must be seen to have got it right. That there's no possible way that a huge piece of machinery could grind people to dust. And we all know, everyone watching this knows that happens regularly. And the only way you don't become that dust is if you're strong enough to get yourself out of it somehow, or if the machinery forgets that you're there. It's impossible to me to kind of imagine how it is that someone took over the post office after all these things started coming out, and still the people around him, the board, the bosses, the minions, all were set on not changing the official stance in any possible way. And you're right, it is exactly like the Ministry of Defence when it comes to the nuclear veterans. It's exactly like the Royal Borough of Kensington Chelsea when it comes to Grenfell Tower. It's exactly like the Home Office with Windrush. It's exactly like South Yorkshire Police with Orgreave and Hillsborough. It's just astonishing. What is wrong with people that you don't admit when you've gone wrong? Leslie says no one takes responsibility anymore. We're like children with no real leader. The last politician, Leslie, who took responsibility was Peter Carrington after the Falklands War when he resigned because he hadn't seen it coming. That is the last time any politician, as far as I can tell, in this country took responsibility for what they did and fell on their sword. Let me know if there's someone more recent, because I can't think of any. Sorry,
Darren. I was about to say that what's quite interesting is, and you know my views around this issue, but I look at the claim or the allegation of racism leveled at Henry Staunton, and he says, look, the moment he decided to speak about these issues and challenge the post office orthodoxy, his card was marked. And to me, that allegation smacks of that. It smacks of something to smear somebody who's prepared to speak out and to provide a true picture of what is going on.
Yeah, who was causing your embarrassment, who was blowing a whistle, and who couldn't be ignored like other whistleblowers because they're the bottom of the pack, because he was the guy at the top of the pack.
Yes.
He was the ace, and he was saying, this is wrong. And so the business secretary, as she was then, Kemi went, yeah, do you know what? Probably said something off colour at some point.
And you know what, Badenoch, and I'll be real about this, she has been an individual who has used race to weaponize or to create a problem in areas before. So we know that she has the propensity to do that. So to see this in this context doesn't surprise me at all. And I think somebody like Henry Staunton, who is prepared to give that detail, give that color, that nuance, if you like, so that so many people can recognize things they've seen elsewhere within the institutional machine. It's so important for Henry to stick to his guns and make sure that the pressure is on the people who should be held responsible to be responsible.
Yeah. Now, the Mirror is broadcasting the Horizon inquiry on the Mirror's YouTube channel. So please make sure, if you want to keep in touch and on top of what's being discussed there and the evidence that's being given every day, but you can go and have a look at that. And it's one of the few media outlets that is actually live streaming this stuff and is keep carrying it. So it is very important to try and keep on top of that if you can. Now, this inquiry is still going on, and it's going to be going on for some time probably. And like we said, we heard today about an institution that's dragging its feet on compensation, that doesn't want to admit that it's done wrong, that is just not really capable of even seeing the need to clean up its mess. And there was, I think, one of the sub-postmistresses, I think it was the National TV Awards a little while ago, who was accepting the award for Mr. Obama, said she's just been into government, been into Whitehall since the change of government after the election, and nothing has changed, she said. We seem to have this justice system, Darren, that grinds exceeding slow. We all know what went wrong, and not just for Mr. Bates. We know what went wrong for years because there was lots of reporting about the post office. We all knew when we woke up that morning and saw Grenfell Tower on fire. Yes. We all knew what happened then. We knew if someone's put something flammable on the outside of the building, that's probably illegal, and they did it to save money. Right? You knew that. Day one. We know from the post office, we know exactly what has happened here. There is no real continuing need, I would have thought, for an inquiry, because they could publish the report and start making the changes and pay the money and issue the apologies and get things going. Here we are sitting here saying, "Oh, look at that, another piece of evidence." You know, it's like the nuclear veterans. Every time I publish another story, it's like I've got another piece of evidence. Why do we have to keep having the evidence? Chris says, Windrush, Grenfell, Post Office, blood scandal, waspy women. The Tories never got justice for any of them. They're all worse off after the scandal and still suffering. They have no intention of paying the Post Office, the sub-postmasters.
Just an answer to Chris. I mean, I think the tactic of, I want to say the institution, because I don't necessarily think it's exclusive to any one political party. I just think the government machine, the tactic has always been wait. And what you've seen as a result is victims, their families, their relatives, their champions pass on. That people forget. People lose the will. People lose the appetite to keep fighting because they're ground down in red tape, or they're ground down by the amount of time it takes. And it's quite a ruthless machine and a ruthless tactic of waiting until people die. And that sounds quite harsh and brutal to say, but it is a harsh and brutal institutional machine that is leaving so many people in despair. And that's what makes me angry. I can't imagine what it makes you, having worked with a real live case with the test vets and so many of the other people either affected by it or touched by it. And I think this will drag on for quite some time unless we get a situation like we did at the awards, where people shame the government and remind the public that the government are still trying to hide behind the machine.
Yeah. And I think we could well be hearing exactly this. If the inquiry does drag on too long, we'll end up hearing evidence about what Keir Starmer hasn't done and what the current business secretary hasn't done and all the rest of it. So it just needs to come to a conclusion, and it needs to be fixed and resolved, for the love of Pete. But institutions do tend to think about things in terms of, beyond the next lifetime, because they get to survive. Other people don't. Which will bring us, I think, fairly neatly to the one piece of good news we have managed to find in the world for you today. Here it is. Now, the Tory caucus in Birmingham has been like watching a slow motion car crash through your fingers. As they applaud Liz Truss, they stick the knife into working mums, do absolutely nothing to make themselves more electable or a more effective opposition. But there's one glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, and it comes in the shape, the impossible to expect shape of Ian Duncan Smith, the architect of the coalition-era welfare reforms, which were swathing in their cruelty, and who campaigned hard for the two-child benefit cap, and who now says, get this, we need to look at getting rid of that. Darren, is this proof that even the most hard-hearted of men is capable of seeing the light eventually?
Well, it's funny, actually, because I was sitting and I just saw a pig fly past my window.
Sows spotted at 20,000 feet.
Yeah, leopards can change their spots. I mean, the cynic in me, I have to say, does partly think this is so symptomatic of the duplicity of politicians. And again, I won't just be exclusive to one party, but you campaign for so long on one thing and suddenly you change your mind and you've got this Damascene conversion. And maybe I'm being uncharitable, and maybe I should just look on the bright side of this, because
Darren's room is falling apart. Maybe it's also got something to do with the fact that it's obviously the two-child benefit cap is now a political issue for the opposition, for Keir Starmer, for Labour government, and that's why perhaps the Tory opposition is starting to think, well, maybe we'll campaign against that now, because there's a political win there. Well, who cares? Actually, if do just get the damn child benefit cap lifted, I don't really care how it gets there.
Well, like we were saying before, the people who matter at this are not the politicians; it's the people who will be affected. And we were talking about that in the context of the other stories. We're absolutely talking about this in the context of the people who will benefit from this, because, as we've seen, some politicians did stand on principle, either resigning away or basically voting against the government on this issue. And it is a difficult time for ordinary people. And we all need all the support we can get. So Ian Duncan Smith, he's my local MP in Chingford. So yeah.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Ian. Well done. Got there in the end. Thank you, Darren, for taking us through all of that. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. We'll join us again on next Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. If you want to keep watching the Post Office Inquiry, it's on the Mirror's YouTube channel. If you're listening on podcast, please leave us a review so other people can find us. Until next week, then, everybody, stay safe, take care. Chatty bye.